First thing I had to do was make sure that my trailer was a candidate for adding brakes. As you can see in the middle of your screen, it has to have a square flange with 4 bolt holes. This flange is what the brake system bolts to on the axle. My trailer had the flange, so the next step was to remove the wheel. Here you can see what the standard hub looks like. I apologize for the quality of this video. It was shot in the dark, but I still think it might be useful to you in outlining what I had to do to make this upgrade happen. Here I'm using a hammer and a flathead screwdriver to pry the old dust cover off the center of the hub. The retaining nut on my setup had a retainer clip that fit over the nut itself and slid into a slot on the axle shaft. I had to remove that in order to be able to unscrew the nut. The retaining nut on both of the wheels from the factory was only put on just a little past hand tight. It was just barely snug, so I made a mental note to not over tighten it when I install the new components. Once the nut is out of the way, the old hub and bearings slide off the spindle. Here I'm installing the brake components onto the flange that's welded to the axle that I pointed out earlier in the video. Here's a close-up of the studs on the back of the brakes that I'm trying to line up with the bolt holes. And I decided to use a thread locking chemical on these nuts, and I used blue Loctite. After securing those 4 bolts, I moved inside to pack the new bearings with grease. I spent a lot of time spinning the bearings and moving them around, trying to get the grease down into the race beneath the rollers, and just generally make sure that it was well packed. After I finished packing the bearings with grease, I installed the larger bearings into the back of the brake drum. I was very careful to make sure that no grease got on the inside of the brake drum to try to make sure that it never contaminated the brake drum or the brake shoes. My kit came with a grease seal, and here you can see that I'm tapping that grease seal into the bearing area to keep grease from leaking out onto the spindle and ending up on the brake pads. A small amount of grease squeezed out from the edges of the grease seal, so I had to clean that up before going to the next step. Next, I installed the brake drum onto the spindle. I had to compress the brake pads a little bit to get the drum to fit over them. With the brake drum in place, I then installed the small outer bearings, followed by the lock washer, the axle nut, and the axle nut retaining clip. The kit I purchased included a new dust cap, so I tapped the dust cap into place using a mallet.